This is the Tudors, Dynasty, and Beyond podcast. History with a twist. And now your host, Rebecca Larson.
Hello and welcome back to the show. I'm your host, Rebecca Larson, and today I am joined by Tracy Borman to talk about her newest book, The Stolen Crown, which explores the transition from Elizabeth I to James VI and First, which is one of the most pivotal political shifts in English history. So, Tracy, thank you so much for being here today.
Rebecca, it is such a huge pleasure to be back on your podcast. So thanks very much for inviting me.
Yes, thank you for agreeing to come on. This book, like I said, it's a very interesting subject to look at. And I feel like we talk about the succession crisis with Elizabeth and, who is she going to name the heir? So what first inspired you to write about this?
Okay, so I remember the moment, it was probably a couple of years ago now, when I was sitting right where I am now at my desk in my study where I write my books. And I saw a news flash from the British Library that said major new Elizabeth I discovery. So you can imagine, as an Elizabeth superfan, I stopped working and I read that press release. And they'd made this astonishing discovery in their archives that changed everything we thought we knew about the transfer of power from the Tudors to the Stuarts. So it all centres around what happened on Elizabeth's deathbed. For over 400 years, we've been told, thanks to William Camden, her earliest biographer, that almost with her last breath, Elizabeth named her Scottish cousin, James VI, son of her old rival Mary, Queen of Scots, as her heir. But the British Library did some work on Camden's original manuscript, and they found it had been changed a bit when James was on the throne. And what they discovered was effectively the new king forced Camden to make those edits. And in his original, they literally scanned the manuscript to see what it looked like before the changes. In the original, they found that Camden just said Elizabeth died without naming anybody. And then James, knowing that he's struggling to hold on to the throne in England, needs Elizabeth's kind of approval from beyond the grave. So Camden's forced to go back and put words in her mouth saying, I will have none but the King of Scots to succeed me. So it was all a lie. And it's a lie that we've been sold for over 400 years. And it inspired me to just write both about the discovery, but also look with fresh eyes at the Elizabethan succession and what a race for the throne it really was, because we tend to see it now as a foregone conclusion. Well, of course, it was James. It was always going to be James. Well, it wasn't, actually. There were any number of claimants with a quite strong right to Elizabeth's throne who might just have snatched the crown from under his nose.
Yeah, most definitely. And I want to get into those claimants so badly. But before we do that, I really want to look at how different the early years, let's say the first 5 years of Elizabeth's reign and James VI reign looked like, because obviously she was much older than him when she came to the throne, but his throne seemed much more volatile.
Oh, yeah. I mean, it was tough to be monarch in Scotland, as James's mother, Mary, had found out. And they both came to the throne very, very young. Mary, 6 days old when she became Queen of Scots. James, 13 months old. So it's kind of like a baptism of fire, really. And Scotland was quite a divided country. There was some very strong nobles who really dominated government. There was division. It was quite hard to please the people and to hold on to the throne in Scotland. Both Mary and James found that. But it wasn't exactly plain sailing for Elizabeth when she came to the English throne, because at least half of her subjects thought she was illegitimate. She was, of course, the daughter of Anne Boleyn, and Henry had annulled their marriage before Anne's execution, which made Elizabeth illegitimate, really. And also the Catholics in England hated her. They thought she was a heretic. So she had her work cut out as well to hold on to her throne. But yeah, I think if it's a contest between how turbulent was each of the crowns. Probably Scotland wins that one.
Yeah, so the Scottish crown. I recently had Stephen Bierpin on to talk about James IV and James V, and it just became so obvious to me, and you mentioned this in your book, how so many of the Scottish kings came to the throne at such a young age, and how like the person before them died tragically in one form or another.
Yes, absolutely. There's so much violence and bloodshed and murder in Scotland. It was quite a dangerous thing to wear a crown or even get anywhere near anybody who was wearing a crown. And James's regents, those who helped govern Scotland before he reached his majority, quite a few of those met a sticky end as well. So what an upbringing.
Okay, let's talk about possible heirs to Elizabeth, because I feel like this is such a big topic because there were so many of them. Where do you want to start with this?
There's a wonderful quote by a contemporary of Elizabeth who said, "This crown is not likely to fall to the ground for want of heads to wear it." So many possible claimants, on average between 15 and 20 people at any one time in Elizabeth's long reign, who were vying for her throne. But you're right, it gets complicated when you look at the various claimants, but actually the vast majority were related to two women, either the elder sister of Henry VIII, Margaret, who married into the Scottish royal family, or his younger sister, Mary. And those latter descendants included the Gray sisters, Lady Jane Grey, the ill-fated short-reigning queen, and her two sisters, Catherine and Mary. So I quite like the fact that in this male-dominated age, actually, nearly all the claimants derived their royal blood from two women.
Yes. And when we go back to Henry VIII's will, right, he named his sister Mary's, children, descendants, not Margaret's. And I still find that so interesting.
Isn't it? And I'm really pleased you pointed that out, because on that basis alone, James VI should never have inherited the English throne, because Henry VIII's last will still stood when Elizabeth was queen. It hadn't been supplanted. And also his acts of succession, they had all nominated the descendants of his sister Mary if his own children died without heirs. Yeah. So, and the reason he disinherited Margaret is that she married James IV of Scotland, and Henry hated the Scots and never wanted to see a Scot on the throne of England. And I have to say the feeling was mutual. England and Scotland had this long-standing animosity. They were almost constantly at war for most of the medieval period, and that carried through into the Tudor period. So there was a sense that Scotland was a foreign country. No Englishman is going to want a Scot on the throne, and certainly Henry didn't want a Scot on the throne, which is why he gave the advantage to the descendants of his younger sister, Mary.
Yes, and we know how well that played out.
So you know what? It's so often the case when I was really struck by this, writing this book, that royal blood was far more of a curse than a blessing. Actually, you wouldn't want royal blood. Because even people like poor Henry Hastings, he was actually Plantagenet. He didn't have Tudor blood, he had Plantagenet blood. He made it really clear, look, I don't want to push my claim. I don't want to be king. Thank you very much. But people kept pushing it for him and saying, no, go for it. You're a man and everybody wants a king on the throne, and you're a Protestant, and that's good too. So, but many of the claimants did not have happy endings in this story.
No, they didn't. So for those who are listening, who haven't read your book, or maybe are new to Tudor history, because there's people coming to the Tudors all the time, can we talk a little bit more about the descendants of Mary Tudor, the sister of Henry VIII, that would have come after her granddaughters, after the Grey sisters? Who were on the list after them?
Okay, so the Gray sisters, I should just mention them a little bit, because Catherine Gray is the most relevant here. She's the middle child, the middle sister. And early in Elizabeth's reign, she married somebody else with a blood claim. Edward Seymour. He was the nephew of Queen Jane Seymour, Henry VIII's third wife. And they had two sons. And so those two sons were very much contenders during Elizabeth's reign. One of them, Edward, actually was still alive when Elizabeth died. And if the law had been followed, he should have been king. But as it was, he didn't manage to rally enough support to oppose James. But there were other descendants from Henry VIII's sister Mary, because one line was the Greys, but the other line was the Stanleys. So Lady Margaret Stanley, fascinating character. Now, the Stanleys were Catholic, so that was good for some people and bad for others. And Elizabeth never trusted Margaret Stanley. She imprisoned her several times, and her son Ferdinando also lived under a cloud of suspicion, even though he wasn't that interested in the crown. He ended up being poisoned. And so it's a dark and it's a very dramatic story. But you do find these claimants, they go on, they endure, that they or their sons or even daughters, they carry the claims that they had all the way through into James's reign, actually. And who knows, maybe some of the lines are still around today, and they might just suddenly fancy making a bid for the throne one day.
When I was thinking about all of the potential heirs to the throne, of course, one of the big ones that comes up then is Mary, Queen of Scots. And obviously, I think most people know how that ended. I feel like it's just, I don't even know how to talk. I know how you feel about Mary, Queen of Scots. I've seen you rage about her.
I'm sorry. I know. There are two camps, I think, Camp Elizabeth and Camp Mary.
Yeah, right.
Yeah, I've got both feet in Camp Elizabeth. But you're right, though, because actually, even though Henry VIII had banned the Stuarts, blood did count. And Mary was the strongest blood claimant to Elizabeth's throne. She was her closest relative. She was her cousin. And her claim was continued by her son, James. And of course, Mary was Catholic. So that made her very, very appealing to half of Elizabeth's subjects, as well as to the great Catholic superpowers of Europe, such as Spain, who were willing to weigh in on Mary's behalf. So it's without a doubt that Mary was the most dangerous claimant for much of Elizabeth's reign. Their rivalry dominated almost 30 years of her reign, until eventually Mary lost patience and left a bit of a paper trail of involving herself in a Catholic plot to unseat Elizabeth, to have her assassinated, and for Mary to take the throne. And of course, as we know, Elizabeth dithered quite a lot over signing Mary's execution warrant, but she eventually did, and Mary was sent to the block. And that was problematic in a number of ways for her son, James, because he'd actually gone out of his way to cultivate a harmonious friendship with Elizabeth. These two, I love finding things out for the first time. And during this book, the course of writing this book, I found out that Elizabeth and James wrote more letters to each other than any two sovereigns throughout the early modern period. So they both put a huge amount of effort into this relationship. And from Elizabeth's letters, it seems that she's sort of grooming James to be a future king of England. She now, we know, did not name her successor, but it seems actions speak louder than words. And she really showed some favour to James that she didn't show to any of the other claimants. And I think it speaks volumes to how much each of them wanted this relationship to work, that they managed to sidestep the issue that Elizabeth had chopped his mother's head off. Elizabeth makes a show of apologising for what she calls that miserable accident. Pretty miserable for Mary. And James eventually says, look, let's just see it as water under the bridge. Let's just forget about it. And neither of us will ever mention it again. And they don't. They move on with astonishing speed. So poor Mary is soon forgotten by her cousin Elizabeth and by her son James.
How early on do you think it was that Elizabeth was already hinting at James that he could be king. Because when I look at it, she was just a master chess player, and
Yeah.
she knew how to manipulate him over the years to get him to do what she wanted.
She really did. And actually, I think as early as the late 1560s, so James was a tiny boy then, Elizabeth proposed to Mary that James be sent to England so that Elizabeth could raise him. And the implication being, look, if you let me do this, then your son will be King of England because I'm going to train him up. So it seems from his very infancy, Elizabeth had him in mind. But why did she never name him? And this is the big conundrum. Well, I think Elizabeth gave us the answer, actually. She was very upfront about why she never named a successor, because she had experience of what it was like to be a direct heir, an obvious heir during her sister Mary's reign. Yeah. And that had led to turbulence and division, because it's human nature. People always gather around an alternative to those in power. You know, if you're not that happy with your leader, you'll look to the next thing. And Elizabeth was that next thing during her sister's reign. And there were rebellions in Elizabeth's name. And Mary could never rest easy in her bed as a result. So Elizabeth made it very clear, this is why I'm not naming my heir. The minute I do that, I put myself in danger. So she doesn't go so far ever as to name James. And he gets really, really frustrated with this. You know, letter after letter begging her, just say the words, name me your heir. And she refuses. There's even a little hint, more than that James lost patience towards the very end of Elizabeth's reign and paid somebody to assassinate her. A man called Valentine Thomas claimed that he'd been paid by James to ride south and murder the Queen because the King of Scots had just got fed up waiting for Elizabeth to nominate him her successor. Well, the whole thing was eventually hushed up. But interestingly, that's another of the events that William Camden wrote about in his original book. And then he was made to alter the wording when he did that rewrite. So no longer is there a reference to assassination. That's changed to ill affection. So that's all James was accused of, not plotting her assassination, but he just had a bit of bad feeling towards Elizabeth. So how history changed.
I love it's all about the narrative when it comes to history, isn't it? It's just
and it's something that resonates today. Of course, you know, those in power control the narrative, and that's absolutely what we see with James and how he really gave Camden no choice. He needed some good PR a few years into his reign in England, and he saw this chance to rewrite history. Thanks to this very well-respected historian Camden, who'd never published, I should say that, he'd never published his account of Elizabeth after first finishing it. So James said, no, make sure it's published, but we need a bit of a rewrite.
I love how smart Elizabeth was. She knew how to play James to get him to do what she needed to protect England's interests. And one of the things that came to my attention when I was reading, you talked about their letters, and you had mentioned that I think it was in most of the time it was in a secretary's hand and she signed it. But I think it was starting at about 1580. They were written by Elizabeth. Can we talk about that?
Yes. Interesting, isn't it? Because it's like she really wants to get her message across now, and she doesn't want somebody doing it for her. She wants that personal touch to really try to persuade James to listen to her, you know, because those letters are full of advice, as I say, about how to be a good King of England. And she says things like, you need to play the king. You need to put on a good show. In other words, people in England love the pomp and the pageantry. And that was Elizabeth's hallmark, of course, her magnificent progresses, her splendid court. And then she says, you know, things like, work with Parliament. In Scotland, the king tends to rule Parliament, but in England, we need to work with our parliaments. Well, James pays lip service to all of this. He doesn't bother writing back in his own hand so much, only once or twice, whereas Elizabeth absolutely does. And he thanks Elizabeth. He's always very grateful for her advice, but he ignores every last word of it, because James is very much like the rest of his male subjects at this time, who strongly believe that women shouldn't rule, and that, as the Scottish theologian John Knox put it, it is monstrous for a woman to bear rule over men. So I think James sees Elizabeth as this patronizing old woman, and he's not going to listen to her. But he really should have, actually, because that was very, very sound advice.
I loved that part of the book. And also one of the things that I wanted to talk to you about, two women who I feel like we shine the light on them, but maybe Lady Margaret Douglas is one, and Arbella Stewart, which I feel like we know so much more about Arbella than Lady Margaret Douglas, but they both had good claims to the throne too, didn't they?
They had really good claims to the throne, and I'm so pleased you mentioned them, Arbella in particular, because I have to admit, I shouldn't have favourites, but she was my favourite claimant. What a story. Oh, my goodness. So, but Lady Margaret Douglas, she was the niece of Henry VIII. So she was the daughter of his sister Margaret, who married James IV. But she was a daughter from Margaret's second marriage. So she was always conspiring. She was quite a formidable woman. She holds the dubious honour of having been thrown into the Tower 3 times and been let out 3 times. Not many people can claim that, I can tell you. That's my place of work. I know this. But she's always close to the throne and trying to get one of her relatives, if not herself, on that throne. But I think she lived to regret making an enemy of Elizabeth during Mary Tudor's reign, because Mary loved Lady Margaret Douglas, and she sort of gave her precedence over the other women at court. And Margaret really lorded it over Elizabeth, thinking, oh, she'll never come to the throne. And of course, she did. And Elizabeth hated Margaret. But Margaret conspired when she herself had sort of lost hope of taking the throne. She conspired with another formidable matriarch of the Elizabethan age, Bess of Hardwicke. So Bess wasn't royal, but she was powerful. She had married her way to the top, if you like, and she was a considerable landowner. She was just a remarkable woman. And these two matriarchs conspired to marry their 2 children in order to produce an heir to the throne. So Bess of Hardwicke's daughter married Lady Margaret Douglas's son, and it worked. They produced a child who would be a contender for the throne, and that child was Arbella Stewart. So she was of that Scottish line, just like James and like Mary, Queen of Scots. But the difference was, and this is where Arbella really had the edge, Arbella was born on English soil. That gave her a huge advantage over James, because in this xenophobic age where Scotland is seen as a foreign country by Englishmen, the fact that Arbella is homegrown, if you like, gives her the edge over James. But unfortunately, and this is what makes her story so attractive and tragic, it's like Arbella didn't read the script. She just had to show up and kind of behave herself, and she would have been in with a shot. But she had this really unfortunate upbringing at the hands of her maternal grandmother, Bess of Hardwicke, in Hardwicke Hall in Derbyshire, because Bess raised Arbella to be very aware of her royal blood. You know, she made everybody bow and scrape to her, but she also denied Arbella any freedom of action. So she even made Arbella sleep in the same room as her until Arbella was well into her 20s. So it was rather like the childhood of Queen Victoria, who complained about the Kensington system where, you know, she wasn't allowed any freedom. And it was the same for Arbella. Because she didn't have freedom, she didn't have any sense of how the world worked, and in particular how the Elizabethan court worked. So she was fatally naive. And when she made her first appearance there in the weeks after Mary, Queen of Scots' execution, she made a complete mess of it. because on the one hand, she upset everybody by being very haughty and arrogant and saying, hey, look at me, I'm royal, I've got a claim to the throne. She even dressed like Elizabeth. But on the other, she was just hopelessly naive about the court. So she flirted with the Earl of Essex, who was the Queen's great favourite, and you just don't do that. And so she offends people left, right and centre, and she upsets the Queen. And Elizabeth actually banishes Arbella from court for the next 3 years. Well, she is still in play as a contender. And in fact, she remains in play as a contender. Hers is one of the last stories in the book because she endures all the way through the later years of Elizabeth and well into the reign of James, when she's still a threat. She's still vying for the throne. I have to admit, much as I love her, she would have been a total car crash as queen, but life would never have been dull.
I was going to ask you, I'm glad that you mentioned that it would have been a car crash. Of those who were considered heirs of Elizabeth, is there one in particular that you think that was English born that would have been a great choice?
Well, I do think I'd like to go back to Edward Seymour, the son of Lady Catherine Gray. Oh. We don't know if he would have been great. That's the thing. We don't know much about him. And I just wonder if there's a reason we don't know much about him. Has he been written out of history kind of deliberately? But he seems to have been quite sensible. He never made any reckless bid for the throne like the other claimants. And yet, really, he had the strongest claim. And I do think I'd like to have seen what he was made of and how much support he could have rallied in England. And I think, if we'd gone with Henry VIII and if Elizabeth had adhered to her father's will and upheld its terms and on her deathbed named Edward, then he might have made a good go at it. And I think we would have had, by law, King Edward VII. So 300 years before we actually got a King Edward VII, which was after Victoria in 1901. But it's just one of those great what ifs, because we don't know enough about Edward to know how good a king he would have made. But that, for me, makes him the most intriguing. And I would love to know more about him and whether he was a pretty safe pair of hands. What we do know is that he had sons and heirs. So the line would have continued. There wouldn't have been any of this anxiety that we had throughout Elizabeth's reign, because, of course, the reason the succession was an issue is her determination to be the Virgin Queen and not give England an heir.
Yeah. Okay, well, I think we have to end with the final days of Elizabeth I, because when I think of her, I always see that painting, and I don't remember who it was by, but it's her sprawled out on her pillows on the floor with people all around her. What did her final days look like? Because we always, when the story is told, it's always, well, as she was dying, they were trying to get her to name somebody, and that's when she named James.
Yes, exactly. And now we know that's not when she named James. She never did. But I'm so pleased you mentioned that painting, because actually I use that when I give talks on this book, because it's great. It's a Victorian painting, but it shows Elizabeth. As you say, she's kind of laying back on her pillows. She's got the deathly pallor of her skin. And it's painted to show the moment of death. When she's at Richmond Palace, she goes there to die, effectively, at the beginning of 1603. She loves Richmond because it's her warmest palace and it's the depths of winter. And then in the painting, kneeling before her is James of Scotland. So it's really like an allegory of the Stuart accession to the English throne. And a fair dose of imagination was used by the artist, because James was 400 miles north in Edinburgh at the time that Elizabeth died. But she was at Richmond, and she went there, followed close behind by all of her council, because they were now at fever pitch, desperate for her to do what she'd resisted for 44 years and just settle the damn question of the succession. And there was one very tense moment when her chief minister, Robert Cecil, urged her. He was by her bedside and he said, "Ma'am, you must name your successor." And Elizabeth sort of roused herself from her bed and said, little man, must is not a word to use to princes. So he was sent out with his tail firmly between his legs. But now we know, because if we take aside Camden's account, where she does name her successor as James, we know that she didn't do any such thing, because none of the other eyewitnesses say that she verbally named James. The closest we get is an account by Robert Carey, who's a descendant of Anne Boleyn's sister Mary, so a kinsman of Elizabeth, who says that at one point on her deathbed, when James is mentioned, Elizabeth sort of raises her hand towards her head. And everybody there apparently knows that means she wants him to be king. But, you know, she made the same hand gesture when the Archbishop of Canterbury was mentioned. So I don't think we can take that too seriously. And actually, there is no reliable evidence that she named James. But, you know, my book is provocatively called The Stolen Crown. But I think it was a theft in which Elizabeth was at least partially complicit, because she had given James an advantage, as I said, that she gave none of the other claimants. So she would have probably been pretty content with how things worked out. But I do think it's significant that she never could bring herself, even on her deathbed, to name James. She was never 100% certain that he was the right man for the job. And of course, things did go quite disastrously wrong for the Stuarts in England pretty damn quickly.
Yeah, they did. It really does make you wonder, while she's laying there on her deathbed, she had to have known her end was near. Why couldn't she just admit that he was what she wanted? At that point, her life was almost over. So what does it matter if she names?
Exactly. You kind of think, what's she got to lose at that point? I do think that is really, really significant, because at that moment, she absolutely wouldn't have been under threat of rebellion. She's got just hours left to live. And I do think it does hint at her uncertainty whether James really was the right man. And I think she just wanted to leave it to fate at the end of the day. And, you know, if it's meant to be, it'll be. They were strong believers in God's will at the time. So, yeah, that's how she left it. But it sort of all started with a lie, therefore, the Stuarts in England, thanks to this rewriting of history that we now know about. And it would have disastrous consequences, because James and his refusal to listen to all of that great advice that Elizabeth had tried to give him, he clashed with Parliament. He didn't play the king. He soon was so deeply unpopular that the monarchy was looking seriously unstable. There was the gunpowder plot against the king, numerous other plots and conspiracies. And then, of course, it got even worse in the reign of his son, Charles, who also clashed with Parliament and ultimately didn't just lose his crown, but his head. So it all unravelled very, very quickly. Within less than 50 years of Elizabeth's death, the monarchy had been destroyed. So, yeah, there would be consequences to this rewriting of history.
Wow. Yeah, how different it could have been had she named somebody else. I just thought of another question, of course. I want to talk about the story about the ring being dropped out the window, and what was happening with that and what was happening with the council.
So, yes, there was quite impressive speed between Elizabeth dying and James being proclaimed king. And that was all thanks to Robert Cecil, who, as I mentioned, was the chief minister of Elizabeth. And he seems to have kind of put his money behind James and thought, OK, probably the best of a bad lot. I'm going to help smooth his path to the throne. So he left no stone unturned in doing that. And he even drafted the proclamation of James's accession 10 years before Elizabeth died. So Cecil had got everything ready so that things could happen very quickly the moment Elizabeth breathed her last. Now, the story of the ring plays into that, because apparently, and we still don't know if it's 100% true, part of it definitely is. Robert Carey, who I mentioned, her kinsman, his sister worked in Elizabeth's household, and they'd made an agreement that when the Queen died, his sister would take a ring off the Queen's finger and drop it out of a window to her brother, Robert Carey, who was waiting pretty much on horseback, ready to ride north to Edinburgh and show the ring to James as an agreed symbol that the Queen was dead and that he was now King of England. Well, we know the bit of that story that's 100% true is that Robert Carey definitely rode to Scotland because he did it quickly. This ride of 400 miles should have taken 4 or 5 days. He did it in 2. He was so desperate to be first with the news because you tend to be rewarded for delivering good news. He at one point was thrown from his horse. So by the time he arrived at Holyrood Palace in Edinburgh, he had blood streaming down his face and he kind of managed to gasp out the words, you're now king. And of course, he did get rewarded very handsomely for it. So I hope the whole of that story is true with his sister dropping the ring out of the window. But certainly we know Robert Carey was first with the news. He was quickest off the mark and he got his reward.
It seems a little problematic, though, for him to be waiting under the window. Like, how long would he have had to sit there?
I know, isn't it? And also what we know is that according to Robert Carey's own account, he was like the council tried to prevent him from riding north with the news because they were trying to put everything in place for the proclamation and all the rest of it. So I think probably the ring bit is embellished, should we say. But yeah, he did make that kind of breakneck ride north with the news.
Well, Tracy, I was just thinking at the beginning of this show, I didn't give any of your titles, and you have so many now.
Don't worry.
I think I was trying to think. I think it's Professor Dr. Tracy Borman, OBE now.
That's it. Thank you very much. Yes, I don't insist on my titles. Don't worry. That's fine.
For those of us, Americans probably don't understand what OBE means, but it's quite an honor. So why don't you explain that to us?
Yeah, so Order of the British Empire, it stands for. And I was given that by as part of the King's birthday honours last year, 2024, for services to heritage. So every year, a number of awards are given out to people for their contribution to society, I guess. So an OBE is one award. You can get an MBE or various other different, or even, the highest would be a knighthood or a damehood. I'll aim for that in the future. Yeah. I was absolutely blown away to even be nominated. It came out of the blue, and it was such an incredible day to go to Windsor Castle in January this year, and it was Princess Anne who gave me my award, and it was one of those just heart-stopping moments. So thank you for mentioning it.
Oh, I love that. Honestly, when it comes to history, English history, even here in America, you are the face of it, especially on PBS.
Oh, great. Oh, thank you. That's so nice to hear.
Yes. I have family members who aren't really into history as much as I am, but I have an older sister who years ago, when I mentioned your name, she knew who you were right away. And so I thought that was quite amazing.
Oh, that has made my day. Thank you so much. That's so lovely. I need to get over there again. It's been too long.
Yes, you do. I would say come to where I am in Minnesota, but there's not much to see here. I mean, maybe if you go to Minneapolis.
Yeah, I'd love to. I would love to. I've never been. So yeah, I need to do a US tour. That'd be great.
Yeah, that would take a long time, I think.
I think so. But let's aim big,
Yes, I love that. Big goals. Well, Tracy, thank you so much for coming on today to talk about your new book, The Stolen Crown. It's out everywhere now, right?
Yeah, it came out in the States on the 4th of November. So it is out everywhere. And it's been such a thrill talking to you. I knew that would be the fastest 40 minutes of my week. It's been so much fun. So thank you for having me back.
Thank you, Tracy.
Thanks for listening to Tudors, Dynasty, and Beyond. If you enjoyed the episode, please take a moment to follow or subscribe wherever you're listening so you never miss a new release. And if you loved it, leave a quick review. It helps more history lovers find the show. Want to support the podcast and get bonus content? Head to patreon.com/tudorsdynasty. You can also find the link in the show notes of this episode. Join the conversation with Rebecca on social media at Tudors Dynasty. Until next time.